Hey, sixth graders. Today we're going to talk about the American Revolution. I want to start a little bit with a couple of things that we're going to kind of skip over en route to this. The next week and a half, we're going to deal with all these revolutions. Some of them are going to be revolutions against government. Some of them are going to be revolutions as in massive changes in the way we do things. So first, from chapter 28, some of the things that we kind of skipped over. What's happening in Europe right now is some of these countries are setting up with absolute monarchies. That means that the king has absolute power. The monarchy, the king, the queen, those people, and they're giving themselves that power because of something called divine right, saying that God has given them that right to rule. And people are kind of finding that they don't really love that, that just one person getting very, very wealthy at the top, making decisions for all of them is not the best system. In Britain, they're dealing with something called a limited monarchy. So you've got a monarch, a king or a queen, still calling a lot of the shots, but they have also a parliament. It's kind of like our Senate or Congress. In the beginning of chapter 29, because we're going to start with section 3, but we're talking about the scientific revolution, which kind of goes hand in hand with the Renaissance. This is kind of the later part of that, talking about people like Galileo and Kepler and Copernicus, talking about science, and the scientific method was developed around these times and looking into things, looking at reason. And then something called the Enlightenment that just people were talking about what kind of rights people had and different ways to govern themselves. Two of those things in the Enlightenment we might talk about are things like natural rights. Okay, that a lot of these Enlightenment principles are what our Constitution was built off of: separation of power, things like that. To the American Revolution, and we're going to kind of follow along with your notes and your book. So, said briefly explain these reasons the colonists were upset with Britain. You probably know a lot of this stuff. That's why we're going to only spend a day on it. You did it in 5th grade. You'll do it again in 8th and 10th. Taxation. Britain was imposing heavy taxes on the colonists. Mostly they had some expensive wars they were dealing with. If you think about the French and Indian War, you think about wars with France, wars in Europe, and trying to keep afloat this huge empire that they had. Representation. So a big thing, this is still on the license plate in Washington, D.C., is taxation without representation. The colonists were mad that they were being heavily taxed, and no one ever asked them if it was okay. So they did not have any representation in Parliament in Britain, which was a problem. The Boston Massacre happened in 1770. That some people were protesting some of these things, and 5 people were shot and killed. A few years later, we have something called the Boston Tea Party, where tea was one of those things that was taxed heavily. The colonists enjoyed their tea, and they were heavily taxed on that tea. And some colonists snuck on some boats and dumped a bunch of tea into the Boston Harbor, and it kind of sparked a lot of the things that we're going to come. There is a political cartoon. It's a very famous, one of the first political cartoons out there, done by Benjamin Franklin. It's the Join or Die political cartoon. It's got the snake cut into 13 parts. And what that represents really is that if the colonies are unified as one, they're going to be all right. This has it chopped. That if that snake is chopped into 13 pieces, it's not going to be very powerful, and that the whole revolution is not going to survive. All right, briefly explain what happened in these years. 1776, Declaration of Independence is signed, and people are joining and saying, we are going to be independent. We don't want to be part of you anymore. 1781, we're kind of skipping ahead here. There's a lot of stuff in this war for independence, the American Revolution. But in 1781, the British surrender. Okay, and in 17 1887, people get together, the First Continental Congress, and they decide upon a constitution to govern our land. Okay, how would you summarize the principles of the U.S. Constitution? This is on page 872. I would summarize it saying that it is setting up freedoms for individuals in our country with limited government participation and systems of checks and balances, something like that. Look at those 6 principles that it's set on. And then next, pick 3 of the first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights, made to the Constitution, and explain what kind of freedoms they protected. Go a little bit beyond what it says in here. I'm going to go through them all and kind of give you a little bit of an idea. The First Amendment to the Constitution, you've probably heard of these. Freedom of speech. That's also freedom of religion, speech, press, assembly, and petition. That means we can say whatever we want in this country. In a lot of countries, it's not that way. There's countries still today that do not have protected speech. So if I were to get on and tweet about the president, I could actually be thrown in jail for that in some countries. Venezuela infamously has a lack of freedom of speech. Number 2, protects the right to bear arms. You've probably heard of this one. This one comes up every now and then in our part of the country. The right to bear arms, that's the right to have guns. This was a big deal in the time of the Revolution because our army was a militia. It was just regular people. 3, prevents government from forcing someone to house troops in his or her own home. That was also a big deal in the time of the Revolution. The government couldn't say, you have to let these troops stay here. Just protects you from government power. 4, protects people at unreasonable search and seizure. Okay, that's a big one still today. The police or the government can't just come into my home and start raiding and looking for things. They have to have a warrant. They have to have a cause to say why they're searching my house. Protects people accused of number 5, protects people accused of a crime from unfair government actions. Basically means you can't just be thrown in jail. These are, if you think back, these are things that were in the Magna Carta too. 6, guaranteed the right to a speedy and public trial. Again, Magna Carta. The Romans had laws like these too. 7, guarantees the right to a jury trial for civil cases. 8, prohibits excessive bail and cruel and unusual punishment. That means you can't just hold someone in jail too. So bail is, if I got in trouble, let's say I got a speeding ticket and I got thrown in jail, you can't set my bail, that's the money to get me out before I'm tried, at $5 million. That would be excessive. 9, protects other rights, not specifically, so that kind of opens it up to some of those amendments later. And 10, powers not given to the federal government belong to the states or to the people. So there's still a lot of back and forth between what right the federal government has and what right the states have. So there's kind of our intro to the, or quick summary through the American Revolution and the Constitution. These are things that you'll study a lot in the future and things that affect your daily life. So it's a good thing to know. Tomorrow we're going to talk about the French Revolution.